Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
For as long as I'd known, there had always been a great Auntie Madsen. And for long as I'd known, she was always someone you needed to fear. My family has always been good at keeping secrets. Some of them were small and mundane, the kind that any family does to spare their loved ones' feelings when it comes to a completed art project, a kind gesture, or a false compliment. Some families have those bigger secrets, the taboo ones nobody talks about. A family member who committed a horrible crime, a tragedy or something horrible that binds the family together in a way outsiders can never understand. For us, that was great Auntie Madsen. Supposedly, my great-uncle Zephaniah had been in love with a local girl. His family forbade it under the guise that her family was of suspicion and stooped in heinous activity. But Zephaniah would not be deterred. Their love grew, and she eventually fell pregnant. She became very cautious, knowing how the family would react, and stipulated he must only see her in a certain location at certain times, a place in the woods near Zephaniah's, a spot where they could build a life together perhaps. But someone in the family discovered the secret and forced Zephaniah under duress to lead them to where the lovers met. When he only leads them partway in, revealing he had a baby with the woman, he was shot by his father, my great-great-grandfather Obadiah, in a fit of rage. Upon hearing the gunshot, the woman let out a blood-curdling scream through the woods, declaring a curse on the whole Monroe family. Then, in front of Obadiah and his cohorts, she set herself on fire, baby in her arms. From that day forward, upon the encroaching end of every Monroe family man, a woman hidden behind a black veil would appear and weep around the home. If they didn't resist, they would die of natural causes regardless of their age. Naturally, there had been many members of the family who disobeyed that and tried to look at her. Some even succeeded, so I'm told, but all met a terrible end. Great-Uncle Ford called her the veiled skank who cost his brother his life and spat on her when she first came to the property and began weeping by his bedside. He was found several days later, mauled by a bear, his genitals torn to shreds and his face practically peeled off from the top down as if he'd been scalped. After Ford's funeral, Great-Grandma Agnes tried dousing her with a bucket of holy water, calling her Satan's little bitch and telling her that Jesus ruled her home. Evidently he didn't. She later took herself to the top of the property, stood out on the roof, and hurled herself from the roof and onto the roof of the well below, her spine snapping in two and folding her inwards as her body plummeted into the well below. Obadiah said he could hear the weeping from the well constantly taunting him. But he learned from his errors and never sought to disrupt Madsen when she came to visit. He abided by her, gave her a room, and told the rest of the Monroe family to never bother her. When she came to his home in his advanced age, weeping and pointing a finger at him, he didn't resist. He just asked for forgiveness. So it went. Some people resisted, others accepted. Our family grew, and the secret was kept until it reached my generation. It was that summer of 1997 that I first met Great Auntie Madsen. Travis, sometimes she will come to visit us. It's important you know that she's a little different. My father would try to explain to a rambunctious 6-year-old me who was still not great at understanding the whole different thing, but there was a palatable fear in his eyes. That kind of instinctive terror that made you pay attention. The unmistakable sense that if your parents, the strongest people you knew, were scared, maybe you should be too. She will never speak to you and never bother you. But, and this is important, son, you must never try to look at her or talk to her. Understand? He had his hands on my shoulders, looking directly at me and making me nervous as I hastily nodded. Don't ever look at her face, son, and don't make any contact with her. Just be polite and don't bother her. It'll all be over quickly. She didn't turn up with a ton of luggage and a merry song in her heart, a scowl on her face with thunder clapping behind her, or any of the kind of grandiose introductions that TV and films had taught me to believe happened when a weird family member came to stay. No. Instead, she turned up at 1:30 in the morning, when I'd gotten up in the night to pee. I remember on the long walk back hearing it, the soft, unmistakable sound of a person sobbing. It was something you're hardwired to detect and immediately run towards. So naturally, even in my half-asleep state, I did just that. I picked up my pace from the bathroom and headed down the hallway to inspect the sound. It seemed to be echoing from our study, but as I readied to turn the corner for our stairs, I felt a strong grip on my forearm pull me back. I was about to scream when I saw it was my dad, wide-eyed and filled with fear as he put a finger to his lips, shaking his head firmly. It took me a few moments to catch my breath, but I nodded. He pointed sharply to my bedroom, and I walked back, the weeping growing louder as I shut the door and pulled the covers over my head. Maybe it was the adrenaline wearing off or that kind of level of fear where your body wears out quickly, but I passed out not too long after. It was the next morning when my parents sat me down and told me my cousin Grant, who lived a few blocks down the road, had been killed. They said it was a failed home invasion, but such is the way, later in life I'd come to find out the truth was far more gruesome. That night, a friend of Grant's had found his way into the property armed with a bunch of tools and evil intentions. He'd stopped taking his medication and believed that he was possessed by the spirit of a Wendigo, destined to eat human flesh. He drugged, subdued, and tortured the entire family, but only Grant would be subjected to his cravings for flesh. When the police found the man hunched over my cousin's body, a piece of Grant's muscle was still dangling from his teeth as he screamed at them, lunging forward and into the path of a spray of bullets. At his funeral, great Auntie Madsen stood in the back of the procession, weeping as his coffin was lowered into the ground. We don't know what he did to upset her, but we can assume he interfered somehow. But being a child, I just thought she was a weird relative and did as I was told when it came to keeping the secret, knowing full well that I'd get punished if I revealed the strange occasional visitor to my home. So it went for over a decade. She would visit one of our homes, we would accommodate, and when we knew who was due to go, we paid our respects. Most of the time it went without major incident. Our family had grown in common sense as the years passed, and nobody wanted to die a horrific death. That all changed when I was 19, and she came for my mother. It was a Saturday night, and we'd been watching B-movie sci-fi films, laughing at the bad CGI and the low-quality acting. Mom's laughter was infectious, filling the room way more than should be possible for such a small woman. She had always kept herself in great shape, focused on her health, and raised me even while holding down a full-time job as a psychologist. Dad worked long hours and she never missed a beat. She was a role model of mine. Seeing the pillar of strength begin to crumble when Great Auntie Madsen walked into the living room, 6 feet tall, face hidden behind a thick black veil and her frame hunched over as she wept, pointing at my mom, it hurt more than words could justify. Her laughter faded. Her already small body looked smaller. Her eyes sank, and she nodded, never breaking eye contact. I remember those next few moments as if they happened in slow motion. My father screaming to stop, my mother's look of pure terror as I flung myself forward and stood between her and this specter trying to take her away from me.
You cannot have her or my dad. You need to find another family member. I don't care who.
I stood defiantly, staring up to this towering figure, the black veil hiding an expression that I was sure was curled into malice, the smell of rot hitting my nostrils, but I refused to back down. Mom turned me around and pulled me in for a hug so tight I thought she would break my back, her weeping into my shoulder matching that of Great Auntie Madsen.
Oh, my sweet boy. I love you so much. But that is a choice I cannot let you make,
she said between sobs, her hands digging into my back, desperate not to let go.
We all have our time, and you know what happens if we interfere with it. Or with her. Let this happen.
I was about to protest when she pulled away, tears streaming down her face, and stared beyond me towards something I was never meant to see. For some reason, maybe in response to my defiance, or to send a message, Great Auntie Madsen had lifted her veil. Mom's face twisted, and I saw something in her I am unable to take from my mind even now, a decade later. Mind-destroying fear. Her eyes widened, pupils dilated, veins grew large on her temples, and her jaw slacked open to let out a scream that threatened to burst my eardrums as she pushed me out of harm's way. Dad shielded my eyes, and we looked away as the screaming continued. Great Auntie Madsen sobbing turning into full-blown wails as it accompanied my mom's suffering. It was a chorus of pain that I don't ever want to hear as long as I live. After a few minutes, I could smell it burning in the air, and despite my dad's insistence, I pulled away to look at where it was coming from. Standing there, hand in hand with Madsen, veil now in its rightful place, was my mother's steadily burning body. The flesh melting from her face, and chunks of it falling to the ground in a slop. Her screaming still continuing as she reached out a charred hand.
Don't ever resist!
She screeched before the smoke filled the room, forcing us to leave the house in a stupor and call the fire department. A neighbor had to hold me back as I fought to get back into our home, screaming, "That's my mom! She's in there!" until my legs gave out and I sobbed. I remember looking over at Dad just the once, his stoic stare never once breaking with the living room window. He knew she was in there, and he knew she would come back again one day for him, for us all. Years would pass, and eventually I would see more cousins taken by Great Auntie Madsen's deft hand and guttural sobs. I moved out, keeping myself near my father. Married and had children of my own, desperate to start a life separate from the Monroe curse. I told my wife of it when we got engaged, warning her of what awaited her. But I don't think she ever took me seriously. I don't blame her. Nobody would if it wasn't in front of them. But that brings us to the present day, to why I'm sitting in my study, hands shaking, and my mind on the brink of insanity. A few weeks ago, I heard the familiar wailing outside of my home, and at first I chalked it up to that of someone drunk, homeless, or mentally ill. But when it persisted and woke up my children on more than one occasion, I began to worry it was her. I hadn't moved that far from my dad's place, so my instinct was that she'd come for him. I video called him and asked if he'd seen her, but he seemed detached when I tried to press him for a reply. Travis, you need to keep a close eye on your family, son, not worrying about me, he said bluntly, emotionally very removed from the conversation. I was confused and, to be truthful, a little upset. What do you know that I don't, Dad? If they're at risk, I need you to tell me, I pressed. Everyone in our family is at risk, he snapped, startling me. That's what being a Monroe means. We are all at risk, and we always will be. He sighed, calming himself down. Look, I'm sorry. I've just been a little worried about this happening. Your grandfather always told me we were fine if she came into the home, and we accommodated.
Honey, I'm just stepping outside for a sec, okay?
My wife called from the hallway. I shouted back to let her know I heard before turning back to the call. Well, she's been wandering the roads outside my home for the last few days. That's why I was worried. It was only the third time in my life I'd seen my father look so pale. Whoa, what do you mean she's roaming outside? She doesn't do that. She just invites herself in, he said, stumbling over his words. Are you sure it's her? It could just be a stranger, someone who's not well. I know it's her, Dad. We've spent enough time around her to know the difference. She just turns up and wails for a bit before going off. I thought she was after you. I paused, realizing how nonchalantly I was discussing what is in actuality a horrifying familial tradition. Why would she do this? Both of us stared for a moment before horrifying realization hit us both at the same time. I sprung from the desk as Dad ran outside and raced to our street. There was no time. I got to my front door just in time to see my wife, who had never fully absorbed the stories and believed them, walking determinedly toward great Auntie Madsen and defiantly telling her to leave their property.
You're scaring our kids, and I can't get a wink of sleep,
she shouted authoritatively. My wife always had a temper. She was a former Marine and fiercely protective of me and the kids.
You need to leave, or I will call the police. You got that?
Madsen stretched out an arm, and I watched in horror as my wife pulled her over her shoulder and judo slammed her to the ground, the veil slipping as I screamed. My dad did the same as he turned the corner. My wife, my poor, wonderful, clueless wife, just stared as the creature snapped its body straight, rose up to its feet, and lifted the veil fully as I turned and shielded my eyes, grateful the kids were asleep and too young to get out of their rooms. What happened next is not something I'm mentally equipped to put down here or anywhere, but she's gone now. My amazing wife of 3 years and mother to my 2 children is gone. Police just put homicide on the report, and they said they'd be in touch. But I know they will never be. The boys keep asking where the mommy is, and I croakily answer, gone to stay with great Auntie Madsen. Every time I do, I feel my soul die a little bit more inside. I sent the boys to stay with their grandpa this morning, giving them a manila envelope for them to open when they're both much older. In it are photos of us as a family, an apology letter to each of them and their inheritance, both monetary and familial. Great Auntie Madsen had stood at the foot of my bed last night, her shoulders hunched up and her body as tall as ever, leaning over me weeping, just a few feet from my own face. I knew what it meant, and I was in no position to argue this time. I've come to a realization that whatever Great Auntie Madsen is, whatever my family's past, present, or future may define her to be, she is clever. She does not take disrespect lightly, and she knows how to hit you where it hurts. As I finish this up, I can hear her sobbing, increasing in its pain, nails gently scratching the door of my study. But I will not open them just yet. I need time to process. I don't even know how long I have once I greet her again, but I can guess. You see, she lifted her veil once I woke up, and I truly understood the depths of her cruelty. The need for her to send a message to the rest of my family and why you must never disobey when she enters our home. Because the face looking back was my wife's. Eyeless and muscles protruding beneath cracked skin. The mouth stuck in a perpetual, dislocated scream.